I'm going to talk to you about a piece of research that I recently published as a book. I'm going to talk about a part of that book, which relates to when FAPLA veterans that I was interviewing in and doing participant observation with in 2012, how they spoke about their youth, their youthful aspirations, and how they had been interrupted by both the war and particularly through compulsory conscription into the Forças Armadas Populares pela Libertação de Angola, or FAPLA. Now, as I say, this research was carried out, it was with rank and file veterans of the FAPLA. It was mostly carried out in 2012, although there was some in 2015. And that was around 20 years after demobilization, and the research was carried out principally for me in Wamble City. And so at the point I was doing the research, these men were already into their middle years. My part of the project was carried out through participant observation with around 40 men. I carried out life history interviews with a subset of them. And then there was a household survey of around 800 veterans from both sides of the conflict. And a subset of these veterans were FAPLA veterans. And I'm going to talk here and there about some of those stats. That household survey was carried out with the assistance of development workshop, I should say, and with the help of Wolfgang Sturjet and Tilman Brook, who are also in the webinar today. And so a lot of these life history interviews and conversations that I'd have in everyday life with veterans, they would often be talking about the lost promise of their youth, which they saw as having been lost because they were forced often to fight in the FAPLA. Most were recruited involuntarily, around 63% described their recruitment as non-voluntary. And even those, I mean, a significant minority had enlisted for political reasons, but most of those who had become disillusioned with the politics of the MPLA, certainly by the time they demobilized. And so the key questions that I'm going to try to get at in this presentation are, how were young men's aspirations and hopes for their futures shaped in the late colonial period in Wamble when they were growing up before military service? How did they react when their aspirations were frustrated by the events of the war? And then finally, what did they prioritize under the constrained conditions of the war? Which parts of their aspirations did they try to hold on to most tenaciously? And I'll argue that the things which they tried to hold on most strongly were those which had quite a strong moral aspect to them, which I think is often missing from literature about young people's agency in settings in war and post-war settings. Okay, so I'll start off just saying very briefly something about the concepts that I used to interpret data which I picked up in Wamble. First of all, I was interested particularly in masculinity. So almost all of the recruits for the FAPLA, certainly in the 1980s, and when most of the men I was working with were fighting, they were all men. So it was a distinctively masculine experience, and I was interested in that sort of generational and gendered experience. And so I think about masculinity as being relational. So you try to construct a masculine identity in relation to other possible identities, both masculine and feminine. It's intersubjective and imbued with power relations in the sense that your options are constrained by people more powerful than you, to simplify. And also, these men's projects often involved on trying to persuade or coerce people into playing the supporting roles in their masculine life projects, for example, wife or junior man or child, whatever it might be. I also use the concept of a life project. So thinking about the labor that these men performed over their life courses to perform particular styles, in this case of masculinity, but also about the socially constituted aspirations that guide that labor. So where do these aspirations come from? Because they're not just freely chosen, of course, they are socially constituted. And finally, I also focus on the fact that in veterans' narratives, there was a real emphasis on the importance of fulfilling certain moral obligations towards significant others in order to establish oneself as a particular type of person. So when they're talking about their young life projects, they're very much focused on fulfilling obligations to others and others fulfilling obligations to them, not just symbolic obligations, but also material ones. Okay, so to move on to say something about some of their narratives about their lives. Now, most of these guys, almost all of them that I was working with, had rural childhoods. A minority of them had peri-urban childhoods. If they did, then they were likely to have grown up in the suburbs of Luanda, which at the time certainly had a fairly rural air to them. Most were born in the late colonial period, so in the 1960s and 1970s. And when they're talking about their pre-service life and where their aspirations came from, they would focus on 4 sets of institutions. So first of all, they would talk about what they themselves would describe as institutions of Ubuntu tradition, and so that's a term that they would use themselves. And the 2 main institutions that they would talk about at the time were the Unjangu, which is the men's house, which would be a building in the center of a village or in a peri-urban neighborhood, where the men of the village would gather to eat together. Elder men would tell the younger men and the boys stories, give them life about give them advice about their life, how to conduct themselves, and also could be a space for dispute resolution and so on. And so it was a space that really was centered around the transmission of wisdom by elder men to younger men. The Ovamba was a circumcision ceremony where boys or young adolescents would be sent away to a secluded place in the countryside. They would be circumcised without anesthetic, taught some of the secrets of the initiates, and particularly of Inganji, who were some masked dancers who were thought to represent ancestral spirits. And again, that was another space where there was quite strict discipline. Older men were in a position of authority, and they were there, ideologically at least, because they were thought to have some sort of privileged form of wisdom. Second set of institutions that they were influenced by were the churches. So around 90% of FAPLA veterans were going to church by the time they were recruited into the army, and they were mainly going to one of the 2 main mission denominations in the region, so the Roman Catholic Church and the Congregationalist Church, or YECA. And the other 2 institutions that they talked about, that they were influenced by at the time, were state schools that most of them were attending. Most of them didn't get to complete many years of education, but most of them attended state schools. And at that time, if you were attending a state school, then you were likely to also have to attend Organizado Pioneers Angolanos, so the MPLA's children's movement, where you would be taught about sort of political ethics, political conduct, and about the party and patriotic duty. And something that really marked veterans' expectations and aspirations from this period is that they had an expectation of generational progress, so that they would achieve sort of higher levels of education than their parents and some sort of stable salaried employment. So they would often talk about how their grandfathers lived in remote rural villages, perhaps they didn't dress in modern clothes, but their fathers had managed to move on from that to get some. Often they were living in small towns or near small towns. They might be carrying out work for colonial enterprises. And they were hoping in their youth that they would be able to progress beyond that to a more modern, and as they phrased it, a more civilized way of life. But as I say, these life courses, these hopes were interrupted by their recruitment into the military. Many of them were recruited very young, so 20% of FAPLA veterans who we surveyed were recruited under the age of 18, and those who weren't were recruited soon after. And as I say, 63% described their recruitment as non-voluntary. They either signed up because they knew that they had to, or they were simply snatched off the street with no warning and had to go and fight. And a certain number of challenges came up in people's stories about the army. And many of the aspects that they talked about were moral aspects. Now, of course, they also talked about danger and they talked about fear. But having survived those dangers and come through, what seemed to count for the most in the long run were the moral challenges of army life and how they managed to navigate them successfully or not. So they described an erosion of men's ability to respect and care for their fellow men, their comrades in the army, because they'd have to follow out, they'd have to carry out quite strict orders of their superiors, of course. So, for example, men who were working in logistics couldn't necessarily give their comrades food when they asked for it because it was strictly rationed. There's a lot of competition between soldiers to get often quite scarce food supplies, and there were conflicts around diverting military supplies into the black market. And they often describe quite a conflictive environment between comrades in the army. There were also temptations to predate on civilians. Some of them admitted to not resisting those temptations, whether by stealing food from farmers, for example, or goods from civilians, or swapping food for sex with women, with civilian women. And then finally, many also spoke about being forced to commit either physical and or sexual violence against civilians, and of the sort of tactics that they would adopt to try to avoid doing that. And the sort of narratives that they give are quite similar to other studies of veterans in Africa, that they would try to exercise a sort of disguised agency. For example, they would take civilians off into the bush and just shoot bullets into the floor and tell them to run away, or they would pretend not to understand an order, or they would pretend to be ill, for example. So they would talk about how they would try to resist serious transgressions through exercising this sort of agency. And they also became concerned during their service about how broader social inequalities translated into the military hierarchy and to chances of survival. So the more educated you were, the less likely you were to be serving on the front lines in the military, and you stood less chance of being injured. They would talk about the sort of racial hierarchies of mestizo people and white officers, white soldiers who were more likely to be officers. And so there was a growing resentment about that. And what really came through in veterans' narratives then are these sort of moral concerns. How can you behave morally in a constrained, immoral environment? How can you avoid going beyond the pale, committing a transgression that you can't really come back from? You can't recognize yourself after you've carried out this sort of transgression. And also a related concern about maintaining your moral capacities. The idea that if you go past a certain point, then you can't necessarily row back from that, and you lose your ability to behave in a moral way and to be a good person. Okay. Eventually, of course, they left the military. Most of the FAPLA veterans that I worked with left by the time of the BSS Accords for a number of reasons. So in the Poema survey, we found amongst FAPLA veterans that the most common reason for leaving was for health reasons. So people had picked up some kind of injury. A significant number were demobilized at the BSS Accords. Around 11% deserted and 6% left for other reasons. And when they left, at this point in their lives, they talk about trying to make up for lost time. And the dominant feature of their life projects at this point, when they're sort of in their mid-20s or slightly later, was to get married, which they wished they had been able to do earlier, and to build a house as a key priority. So not to rent one or to live with relatives, but to build their own house or to have it built. And they talk about their struggles to establish livelihoods in informal commerce in the cities. So most of these guys went to one city after they demobilized. And they weren't used to living in an urban environment. They had never undertaken informal commerce before. And it turned out to be quite an unreliable way of making a living, but it was their only option. And the sort of breadwinner model of masculinity emerges as sort of key fulcrum of veterans' life projects in this period. So the idea that if they provided for members of their household and perhaps kin members beyond the household, then they thought that they should be able to have respect from those family members and to some sort of authority over them. And this is a really central part of their masculinity and what they were trying to achieve at the time, this sort of organization of moral rights and responsibilities. But it was constantly under threat because their livelihoods were so uncertain, because often their wives had more experience in informal commerce and might start earning more money than them and so forth. And so when they're thinking about their disillusion with the party state and with the political sphere, they're often reading it through that lens. So the MPLA has not given us the means to have dignified lives as men because we can't support our families, for example. But there were a number of reasons for disillusion with the political sphere, and it wasn't just a disillusion with the party state, but with formal politics in general. So that was partly because they were waiting still in their middle age for some sort of compensation from the MPLA party state, whether that was in the form of education or employment or pensions. They hadn't received very much at all, if anything, from the party state since they had left. And so this immoral covenant had been broken as they saw it. They were also disillusioned by the arbitrary violence that they'd witnessed during their service and afterwards. And often they would talk to me about the distorted representations of national history that political movements would put out during the war and afterwards. That would center on the sort of self-interest of those movements and wouldn't tell the truth about particularly the experience of veterans during the war. So they would often miss out sort of the MPLA's narratives in the post-war would sort of miss out the Civil War entirely and just talk about the heroism of people who fought in the Independence War. And for obvious reasons, they resented that very much. And a lot of their anxieties when they left the army was about how models of the masculine life course were being transformed. So the institutions of the Unjango and the Abamba were largely absent from their post-service surroundings because they didn't have an Unjango in an urban neighborhood where there was a lot of pressure on space. And it was too dangerous to go out to the countryside, take children out to the countryside to a secluded space because a lot of fighting was happening in the countryside, so you couldn't carry out the circumcision ceremony. And so they were concerned about the sort of loss of authority of elder men and of that patterning of the life course, of the masculine life course. And at the same time, they thought that there was a changing social role of money. As the economy liberalized in the 90s and certainly in the post-war period, the party state elite became ostentatiously rich. They felt that this was corrupting their children's generation. They respected people with money. They wanted to gain money as a shortcut to getting respect rather than trying to accrue respect across the life course through the gaining of wisdom. And so traditional institutions that I mentioned here on have lost much of their power. The state and the sphere of citizenship and formal politics, much of its power, for the reasons that I've just mentioned. And a set of institutions that's maintained some sort of moral authority, most of these men, were the churches. And this, even though there was huge religious transformations in Angola throughout the war, a proliferation of different denominations and so forth, churches were still seen as the only institutions that were somehow recognizable from these men's youths that maintained some sort of moral authority and allowed them to pursue their youthful aspirations in some kind of recognizable way. And during the war, that role was sort of emphasized because the churches offered some sort of existential reassurance. When people's relatives were often dying in large numbers, their villages had disappeared, the promise of salvation, the promise of God's protection was very powerful for a lot of people in uncertain times. And also, having lost their village communities, it was often, coming back into the city, a place where they could find a supportive community, where there was some kind of ethics of mutual respect and support. Now, of course, as we know in Angola, religious moralities were certainly not uncontested. On the contrary, it was a space of quite vigorous contestation. But at least veterans would say there was a common reference for those contests, those moral contests for the high ground in Scripture. So there was some kind of basis upon which those debates could be carried out. Whereas in the political sphere, they said there's so much going on, you can never be sure what's true, and so that was another reason that they would withdraw from the political sphere into the religious sphere. And also there was the fact that in most of these churches, elder men held positions of authority, whether lay positions or as pastors or priests. And so there was a chance for them to have their wisdom as elders recognized in these communities. Okay, so to conclude, I'm just going to say a few things about how this might relate to some of the influential literature about the agency of young people in wartime. Now, a lot of the most influential models focus on improvisation and sort of calculations that young people make under the constrained and dangerous conditions of war. So Alcindor Hondwana, in her work on child soldiers in Mozambique and Angola, and Matt Sutas in his work in Liberia used Deselto's idea of tactical agency. So trying to improvise, make the best of the opportunities which come up, but not really having much control over the long term. So not being able to have a power base from which to operate and exercise strategic agency. And Henrik Fick in his work on Guinea-Bissau uses the idea of social navigation, which is related to the idea of tactical agency, but it's kind of more future oriented. So people are trying to survive, but also to map out into the future, to understand how the social ground is going to shift during the war and where they ought to hedge their bets if they want to try to have some sort of upward social mobility and to survive into the future. But what I would argue is underemphasized in these accounts is the moral dimension of these projects. So we get an idea that people are trying to survive in the war, that there's this sort of emergency model of agency. We get the idea that people are looking for social mobility. But I think that these projects also have really strong moral aspects, as I've argued in the case of FAPLA veterans, that people are often trying to protect their moral character and their moral capacities, not to transgress certain moral standards. And if we want to understand the agency of young people as they try to fulfill their ambitions, then we need to understand how those moral outlooks, those moral aspirations come to be constituted. And that's what I'll say for the moment. Thank you.